I walked into the Rivergate County courtroom with my prosecutor's badge in my pocket. Today, I was the defendant. They called me the abandoned child, then sued me for the $2.7 million my grandfather left me. I thought they only wanted the money, until I discovered they had already sold my future for something far worse. They turned blood into a weapon, and I'm going to show you exactly how. My name is Sutton Hale. I am 32 years old, and for the last 6 years, I have been an assistant county prosecutor for the Rivergate County Prosecutor's Office. My entire professional life is built on standing at a polished oak table, facing a judge, and arguing for the truth on behalf of the people of Pennsylvania. Today, I sat on the wrong side of the bar. The courtroom was the same one where I'd secured my first felony conviction, Civil Division, Courtroom 3B. The air hummed with the same flat, fluorescent buzz. The stone floor was the same pale, blue-veined marble that always looked cold. No matter the season, the benches behind me were the same unforgiving, scarred wood. Everything was familiar, but inverted. The geography of my life had been flipped, and I was the one in the defendant's chair, a hard, unupholstered seat that felt impossibly small. My prosecutor's badge was a heavy, reassuring weight in the inner pocket of my suit jacket, a talisman against the fiction being spun into the official record. Then they entered. It was not an entrance, it was a debut. My biological mother, Diane Hale, glided in first, a cloud of expensive, funereal perfume, something with tuberose and grief. Arriving before she did, she was draped in a black cashmere coat that probably cost more than my first car. She was flanked by my biological father, Peter Hale, who looked, as he always did, like a man perpetually uncomfortable in a suit. His face flushed with a mixture of self-importance and barely concealed panic. Leading them, like a drum major for the damned, was Graham Lyle. Lyle was the kind of lawyer who wore monogrammed cuffs and shoes that cost 4 figures. He was all teeth and theatrical sincerity, a man who saw the law not as a set of principles, but as a box of props. He placed a hand on Diane's back, guiding her to the plaintiff's table as if she were a fragile relic, not a predator. She dabbed at the corner of her eye with a silk handkerchief. The performance had begun. The court officer called the case, docket CV 7704, Hale versus Hale. Judge Miriam Collier looked up over her glasses. Her gaze swept past Lyle, past Diane and Peter, and landed squarely on me. I saw the flicker of recognition, the mental recalibration. Judge Collier was sharp, fair, and had no patience for theatrics. I had argued 3 complex fraud cases in front of her. She knew my work. She knew my reputation for meticulous, unyielding adherence to facts. And now, she was watching me sit at the defendant's table, being sued by my own parents. The air in the room didn't just shift. It reversed polarity. I gave a slight, respectful nod. She did not nod back. Lyle rose, his voice smooth and resonant, filling the cavernous room. Your Honor, we are here today on a matter of profound tragedy. I watched his reflection in the polished wood of the jury box. He paced, his hands clasped. We are here to protect the legacy of a great man, a giant of the Pennsylvania judiciary, the Honorable Arthur Whitlow. My grandfather, the man who had actually raised me. A legacy, Lyle continued, his voice dropping to a sympathetic murmur, that in his final, fog-filled days was cruelly usurped. He turned and pointed, not at me, but at the general concept of me. His own granddaughter, a woman in a position of power and trust, used her proximity, her access, and her legal training to exert undue influence over a vulnerable, aging man. She systematically isolated him, turned him against his only child, Diane, and at the last possible moment, manipulated him into signing a new will, a will that disinherits his daughter and grants the entire estate, an estate worth $2.7 million, to the very person who isolated him. The accusation hung in the stale air, ugly and precise. I felt the familiar, cold burn of adrenaline, the precursor to a cross-examination, but I wasn't allowed to speak. My gaze drifted to Diane. She was looking at her lap, her shoulders shaking in a perfect, rehearsed tremor of sorrow. On her wrist, a brilliant circle of diamonds flashed under the fluorescent lights. I knew that bracelet. Grandfather Arthur had given it to her for her 40th birthday, a birthday she had forgotten to invite him to until the last minute. She'd called him from the party, drunk and laughing, telling him she needed a real present, and he, hopeful as ever, had overnighted it. She'd never called to say thank you. It was, I realized, a down payment, a prelude to the kind of entitlement that now filled this room. She wore her exploitation like jewelry. My lawyer, Evan Rourke, stood up. Evan was the opposite of Lyle. He was tall, quiet, and wore the same gray functional suit to every meeting. He didn't perform. He presented. He placed a single, thick, ivory-colored file on our table with a solid, definitive sound. Your Honor. Evan's voice was a calm counterpoint to Lyle's operatic pitch. Mr. Lyle's claims are not only baseless, they are provably false. We are prepared to present overwhelming evidence to that effect. He tapped the file. We have month-by-month cognitive assessments from Judge Whitlow's primary care physician and a board-certified neurologist. We have his personal, handwritten journals with daily entries spanning the last 5 years. We have notarized video depositions, recorded just 3 weeks before his passing, in which he explains, in his own lucid and forceful words, exactly why he was changing his will. In the back of the courtroom, I heard the distinct, mechanical click of a DSLR camera. A reporter from the Rivergate Local, a man I'd given quotes to a dozen times, was snapping photos. Lyle half-turned, a phantom smile playing on his lips. This was part of his plan. He wasn't just suing me, he was trying to ruin me. A prosecutor accused of manipulating an old man. It was a career-ending headline. He had invited the circus. Judge Collier held up a hand, silencing both of them. Her eyes were fixed on the docket schedule. This court is not interested in a media spectacle, Mr. Lyle, nor is it interested in a protracted discovery battle. Her gaze cut to him. You have filed a motion to invalidate a will based on lack of capacity and undue influence. I am scheduling an expedited evidentiary hearing on the sole question of Judge Arthur Whitlow's testamentary capacity at the time the new will was executed. She looked at her calendar. 1 week from today, 10 a.m. Be prepared with your medical experts. 1 week. My hand, resting on my lap, clenched into a fist. I could feel the sharp edges of my fingernails digging into my palm. The room compressed. The hum of the lights intensified, and beneath it, I heard another sound, the thud of the judge's gavel. It struck the wood block, and the sound reverberated inside my chest, perfectly in time with my pulse. Thud, thud, thud. The sound snapped a wire in my memory. Suddenly, I wasn't 32, I was 4. I was standing on a gravel driveway in New Harbor, Rhode Island, the salt spray cold on my face. I was holding a small, red suitcase. I was watching the taillights of Peter's car disappear down the road. Just for a few months, Diane had said, her voice bright and false. The gavel struck again. This court is in recess. The sound of the car door slamming, final and metallic. The sound of the gavel, sealing the present. They were the same sound. I looked at Diane. She was rising, arranging her face into a mask of tragic dignity for the reporter. I felt a cold, clean line of resolve cut through the panic. I had spent my career fighting for victims, for people who had their lives torn apart by liars. I would not let this woman, who had abandoned me for a life of comfort, waltz into a courtroom and use crocodile tears to steal the last thing the man who truly raised me had left me. She would not turn this into her theater. I stood, my back straight, the prosecutor inside me taking over. Your Honor, Lyle's voice boomed out again, stopping everyone. One final motion before the court recesses. Judge Collier turned, her impatience obvious. Given the defendant's unique access, he said, letting the insinuation hang in the air, and the substantial liquid nature of the estate. The plaintiffs move for a temporary injunction to freeze all assets, pending the outcome of the hearing. The final public slap. He was accusing me, in open court, of being a thief. He was trying to bleed me dry, to cut off my ability to pay Evan, to fight back. It was a vicious, calculated opening blow. Judge Collier looked at me, her expression unreadable. She looked at the file Evan had placed on the table. "Motion denied," she said, her voice flat. "See you in 1 week." She swept from the room. Lyle's smile tightened for a fraction of a second. He had lost the first skirmish. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. I nodded to Evan. I didn't look at Diane or Peter as they bustled out, surrounded by Lyle's entourage. I just stood there, my hand in my pocket, fingers wrapped around the cold metal of my badge. The hearing was over, but the war had just been declared, and I, Sutton Hale, was finally going to try my own case. The courtroom noise faded, but the buzzing in my head remained. The sterile, cold feeling of the Rivergate Courthouse was a universe away from where my life actually began. It began not in a hospital in Pennsylvania, but on a gravel driveway in New Harbor, Rhode Island, smelling of salt and low tide. I was 4 years old. That is the first memory I have that is entirely sharp, a piece of glass I can turn over in my mind. Diane and Peter Hale, my parents, were sending me to stay with my maternal grandparents. It was not called abandonment, it was a visit. "Just for a few months," Diane had said, her voice a bright, brittle chirp that didn't match the anxiety in her eyes. "Just until we get settled in the new place." Peter, silent as ever, loaded my small red suitcase into the trunk of their car. He avoided looking at me. I stood on the porch of the large, gray-shingled house, holding the hand of a man I barely knew, Judge Arthur Whitlow, my grandfather. The car pulled away. I watched the red taillights disappear into the coastal fog. A few months became the permanent architecture of my life. The visits they promised never materialized. The phone calls, at first weekly, stretched to monthly, then to holidays. They became a collection of static-filled excuses. "Work is just crazy, sweetie. Peter's boss is a nightmare." Then the postcards started. Glossy, bright snapshots of places I couldn't picture. Arizona deserts, Florida beaches, once, bewilderingly, Niagara Falls, on the back, Diane's looping. Optimistic script. "Wish you were here. We miss you." For my 5th birthday, I got a postcard from Miami. For my 6th, a card with an IOU. "We owe you a big one. Love, Mom and Dad." That IOU became the standard. The debt compounded, interest and principal, until it was an unpayable, imaginary sum. While Diane and Peter became two-dimensional figures on glossy cardstock, Arthur and Evelyn Whitlow became my world. They were my true north, my constants. My grandfather, Arthur, did not raise me as a child. He raised me as a future colleague. He was a retired judge, a man whose mind was a steel trap of logic, precedent, and quiet integrity. He did not read me fairy tales at night. He sat on the edge of my bed, his voice a low rumble, and read me summaries of his most interesting trials. He told me stories of clever cross-examinations, of juries who saw the truth, and of liars who were too smart for their own good. He gave me my first leather-bound notebook when I was 8. "You listen, Sutton," he'd say, tapping his temple. "But you write it down. People forget. The page remembers." He taught me how to take notes. He taught me how to ask questions. Most importantly, he taught me the critical, agonizing difference between what was fair and what was merely the law. "Justice," he told me, his eyes fixed on the gray Atlantic outside his study window, "is about balancing the scales. The law is just the framework that holds them. Never confuse the two." If Arthur built my mind, my grandmother Evelyn built my world. She was the counterpoint to his intellectual rigor. She was all warmth, routine, and unspoken affection. She taught me the quiet discipline of domesticity. She taught me how to bake bread from scratch. the science of yeast, and the necessity of patience. She taught me how to arrange the flowers she grew in her garden, always in 3s and 5s. "Sutton," she'd murmur, her hands deft and sure. "Never in even numbers. The eye needs imperfection to find the beauty." We had dinner at 6 o'clock sharp every single night. No television, no distractions. Just the three of us at the heavy mahogany table, discussing our day. In that house, love wasn't a grand, sporadic gesture like the ones Diane promised in her postcards. Love was a habit. It was the reliability of dinner at 6. It was Arthur listening to my day as if it were sworn testimony. It was Evelyn placing a warm slice of bread on my plate without my having to ask. It was presence. I learned to live in this new reality. I excelled in school. It was the one arena where effort guaranteed a result, where the rules were clear. When I won the state debate scholarship in high school, the invitation came with 2 tickets for my parents. When I graduated valedictorian, I saved 2 seats in the 3rd row of the auditorium. When I was inducted into law school, I found myself scanning the crowd, just for a second. Those 2 seats, always reserved in my mind for Diane and Peter Hale, were always empty. They were a void I learned to navigate, a patch of ice on an otherwise solid road. They did visit. I can count the times on one hand, maybe 5 times in the 28 years since they dropped me off. These appearances were disruptive, chaotic events. They would arrive late on a Saturday, blaming traffic, Diane sweeping in with a flurry of air kisses and oversized sunglasses, Peter already checking his watch. They brought expensive, inappropriate gifts, a designer handbag for my 16th birthday, when all I wanted was a specific textbook on constitutional law. The visits were a performance. They were loud, full of Diane's high-pitched laughter and Peter's forced interest in my grandfather's fishing trophies. They would leave early Sunday morning, citing a breakfast meeting or an early start at work. The photographs from those weekends are unsettling. We are all smiling, but everyone's smile is off-center, forced. They look like pictures of hostages trying to signal the camera. Diane's hand gripping my shoulder too tightly. Peter already halfway out of the frame. They were strangers playing house for 48 hours. The illusion of family shattered completely when I was 23. In my 2nd year of law school, Grandmother Evelyn passed away after a brief, brutal fight with pneumonia. The funeral was simple, exactly as she would have wanted. Hydrangeas from her own garden filled the small New Harbor church. The air smelled of old wood, lemon polish, and the sharp, clean scent of the nearby ocean. I stood by the graveside, my hand gripping my grandfather's. His stoicism was a fortress I sheltered behind. The 2 empty chairs in the front pew were a physical condemnation. Diane called, her voice thick with a theatrical sorrow that I could hear was manufactured. She was utterly devastated. She wept into the phone, but she and Peter were on a prepaid vacation in Cancun. The airline, she explained, was charging simply astronomical fees to change the tickets. Evelyn would have understood, she assured me. She knew how much we needed this break. Peter, in the background, mumbled something about a non-refundable golf package with his company. They didn't come. That night, the big house was impossibly quiet. The routines that Evelyn had built were suddenly gone, and the silence was deafening. I found Grandfather Arthur in his study, sitting in the dark, the folded burial flag from the coffin resting on his desk. He wasn't reading. He was just looking at the flag. He looked up as I entered. His eyes were clear, the grief held in check by decades of judicial discipline. He didn't cry. He gestured to the empty chair opposite his desk. "Sutton," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You must always remember this. What is fair is often much harder to bear than what is easy and unjust." He was talking about my grandmother's death, but he was also talking about Diane and Peter. In that moment, he released me from the obligation of pretending they were anything other than what they were. He gave me permission to see the truth. That night solidified my path. I had always leaned toward the law, a little judge, as Arthur called me, but after seeing the casual, cruel negligence of my parents, their inability to show up even for death, I knew my focus. I chose criminal prosecution. I wanted to stand in a courtroom, not for myself, but for the people who had no one else. I wanted to be the voice for those who had been silenced, abandoned, or ignored. I would be the person who showed up. Years passed. I graduated. I passed the bar. I joined the Rivergate County Prosecutor's Office. The first time the Rivergate Local published an article about one of my cases, a conviction in a complex check-kiting scheme, my phone buzzed. It was an email, not a call, an email from Diane. The subject line was, "So proud." The body of the email was short. "That's my prosecutor daughter. We must celebrate soon. Love, Mom." She had forwarded the article to her entire email list. It was the first time she had claimed me so publicly, so proudly. She wanted the headline. She wanted the social currency of a daughter who was a prosecutor. But she never called to ask about the case. The celebration, like the birthday gifts, remained an IOU. Grandfather Arthur saw it all. He was a judge for 40 years. He read people better than he read case law. His health began to fail. Slowly at first, then all at once. I took weekends off, driving the long hours to New Harbor, balancing my caseload with his medical appointments. About a year ago, during one of those visits, I found him at his desk, his estate planner at his side. His hand, though thinner and marked with age spots, was firm as he signed the documents. After the lawyer left, he slid a single, handwritten note across the desk. It was separate from the main will, but I would later learn it was notarized and attached. "Read this," he commanded. I picked it up. His handwriting, once so bold, was now thin and spidery, but the intent was ironclad. "I leave my entire estate," it read, "not to the child of my blood, who has been an absence, but to the child of my life, who has been a constant. I leave it to my granddaughter, Sutton Hale. She is the child who was chosen by default, and who, in turn, chose to be present every single day. This is not a decision made in anger. It is a decision made in fact." I knew, even then, this would be a fight. I knew Diane's bottomless, casual entitlement. But the true, desperate root of the conflict wasn't just entitlement, it was panic. The whispers I had heard over the years about Peter's bad luck had grown louder. His job was precarious. His hobby, which I'd overheard Arthur discussing with my grandmother years ago, had apparently become an addiction, gambling on semi-pro baseball, of all things. The IOUs he'd given me for birthdays were nothing compared to the debts he owed elsewhere. They weren't just looking at Arthur's $2.7 million estate as a windfall. They were looking at it as a lifeline they believed I had just stolen, and now, in a Rivergate courtroom, they were coming to collect. The week Judge Collier gave me was not a luxury. It was a deadline. Evan Rourke immediately began filing motions and preparing our expert witnesses. But my job was different. I was a prosecutor. I knew a case wasn't just about what you argued. It was about what you could prove. Lyle had built his case on a fiction, a fog-filled decline of a great mind. I had to answer with a timeline of irrefutable facts. I had to find the evidence Arthur had left for me. The night after the initial hearing, I drove the long, dark highway back to New Harbor. The house on the coast was exactly as I'd left it after the funeral. Silent, orderly, and smelling of old books and lemon oil. The air was heavy with his absence. I went straight to his study. It was a room I knew better than my own apartment. Walls of mahogany shelves lined with case law, history, and philosophy. A large, worn leather armchair facing the Atlantic. This was the room where he had taught me to think. I started with his desk. It was immaculate, but I knew my grandfather. He was a man of layers. I looked at the silver-framed photograph on the corner of his desk. It was the two of us, taken after I passed the bar. I was beaming, holding up my certificate. He was beside me, his smile small but radiating a pride so intense it was almost tangible. I picked up the frame. My fingers found the small metal tabs holding the backing in place. I turned them, and behind the velvet-covered cardboard, taped flat, was a small, antique brass key. I knew immediately where it went. On the bottom shelf, behind a row of Blackstone's commentaries, was a simple wooden box, dark cherry or walnut, lined with faded blue velvet. It was a box I had seen my entire life but had never been invited to open. I slid it out. The brass key fit the lock perfectly. I opened the lid. There was no treasure inside, no stocks, no bonds, no hidden cash, just paper. On top was a thin, black, leather-bound notebook, not a journal, but a ledger. I opened it to the first page. His familiar, precise script filled the page. It was a record of payments. The first entry was dated 22 years ago, just a few months after I had been sent to them. Diane Hale, $2,500, wire transfer. I turned the page, and the next, and the next. Every single month, for 22 years, $2,500, like clockwork. I did the math in my head, my prosecutor's mind clicking through the numbers. 264 payments, $660,000. This was not a daughter receiving an occasional gift. This was an allowance. This was a fee. On the inside cover of the ledger, in that same steady hand, he had written a single note. It was not dated. It didn't need to be. Sent hoping for a visit, got silence in return. My hands were shaking. This was not a gift. It was a transaction. It was the price he paid for the privilege of raising his own granddaughter, the one his daughter had discarded. Beneath the ledger was a stack of papers, held together with a binder clip. They were printed emails. I recognized Diane's email address, the one she'd used to send me the "so proud" message. These were addressed to Arthur. The pattern was sickeningly clear. They were all variations on a theme. Dad, things are just so tight this month. Peter's commission was smaller than we expected. Dad, I know we said we'd come up for Sutton's birthday, but we have this amazing, non-refundable opportunity in Florida. Dad, Peter needs a little help to get over this hump. If you could just front us a bit extra this month, it would mean the world. You know we'd be there if we could. You're doing such a wonderful job with Sutton. It's better for her to have the stability there, don't you think? We just need money right now. Mom and Dad need money. Can you keep the grandchild? He had printed every one. He had kept the receipts for his own abandonment. Next was a manila folder labeled PH Finances. It contained bank statements, not his, but photocopies of joint statements for an account held by Peter and Diane Hale, an account he clearly had access to, perhaps as a condition of his monthly payments. I cross-referenced the dates. My stomach tightened. The emails asking for a little help and an advance on the monthly $2,500 lined up perfectly with specific dates. I didn't recognize them at first, but then I saw Arthur's notations in the margins. N.L. Division Finals. A.L. Playoffs. The requests for extra money, the financial emergencies, coincided with the end of the semi-pro baseball seasons. Peter wasn't just unlucky, he was losing. And my grandfather was covering the spread, the withdrawals from their account, the ones that depleted the $2,500 deposits in a matter of days, were all from ATMs near casinos or checks made out to individuals I didn't recognize. Then I found the photographs, a small stack of glossy prints, Diane and Peter on a boat, the water a shocking, impossible blue, Diane and Peter holding colorful drinks at a beachfront bar, laughing, tan, and carefree, on the back. Diane's script. Mediterranean Dream, July 2018. July 2018, my 25th birthday. I remembered that day clearly. Grandfather Arthur had taken me out to my favorite restaurant in New Harbor. We'd shared a creme brulee, and he'd given me a vintage fountain pen, the one he'd used to sign his first judicial order, while I was blowing out a single candle on a shared dessert. They were living a Mediterranean dream on his money, the money he sent them, hoping they would use it to come see me. This was no longer about a grieving daughter. This was about a pair of grifters. I turned to his computer, the one Evan had already secured a mirror image of. I powered it on. The desktop was clean, organized. I searched for Graham Lyle's name, One file popped up, a Microsoft Word document. Lyle Inquiries, Doc X. My blood went cold. The file's creation date was 6 months ago. 6 months before Arthur updated his will. 6 months before he died. I opened it. It was a memo, written by Arthur to himself. Graham Lyle, Esco, contacted me today, purported to be representing Diane's interests, inquired as to my estate planning, my health, and my current relationship with my daughter. He used the phrase, securing Diane's future. When I informed him my estate planning was a private matter, he suggested that a man of my age could be easily confused by complex documents and that Diane was worried about me. This is the third such call I have received from associates of my daughter. The first two were financial planners. This is the first lawyer. They are circling. He knew they were coming for him, for his money, even before he was gone. Lyle hadn't just taken this case after Arthur's death. He had been part of the strategy to begin with. He had been testing the waters, looking for weakness, for the fog he would later claim in court. I sat back, the pieces locking into place. I pulled out a legal pad and began to draw a timeline, just as I would for a complex fraud case. Column 1, date of wire transfer. Column 2, email from Diane. Column 3, Peter's known gambling losses. Column 4, Diane and Peter's vacations. Column 5, my significant life events, the birthdays, the graduations, the debate wins. The pattern was not just a pattern, it was a blueprint. It was a business model. A spike in gambling losses would trigger a desperate, loving email from Diane. A large transfer from Arthur would follow. That transfer would be immediately depleted, and then, a few weeks later, photographs of a new trip or a new car would appear. The few times they did visit, I saw now, came right after Arthur had threatened to cut off the money. Their presence was a negotiated settlement. I found his personal journal, the one he kept by his bedside. I flipped to the entries from the past year. Most of it was about his health, his garden, my cases, then an entry from 8 months ago, right before the Lyle inquiry. Diane called. She did not ask about my blood pressure. She did not ask about my physical therapy. She did not ask about Sutton's latest trial. She asked, "Dad, I just need to know, what is my share? Peter and I need to plan." I told her the only share worth discussing was the time she had willfully forfeited. The line was quiet for a long time. Then she hung up. My case was no longer just about undue influence. It was about theirs. I thought I had found it all, but there was one last piece. Tucked into the back of the velvet box, under the lining, was a folded piece of yellow legal paper, his handwriting. "Sutton, if they sue, and they will, this is not a fight about love, it is a fight about numbers. They will call me senile. They will call you a thief. Do not let Diane's tears distract you from the ledgers. Find Camille Ortiz. She was my home nurse. She administered the cognitive tests every week. She knows my mind better than they ever did. She kept the records. She is a rock." And then, one last item, taped to the back of the note, a single, black USB flash drive. I knew, instinctively, what it was. It was the item Evan had mentioned in court. The one item I hadn't seen yet. The one Arthur had given his lawyer for safekeeping, with instructions to give me a copy only if a suit was filed. I plugged it into the laptop. A single video file appeared. I clicked it. My grandfather's face filled the screen. He was in his study, sitting in his leather chair, the Atlantic gray and churning behind him. He looked thin. He looked tired, but his eyes were bright, fierce, and utterly lucid. He looked directly into the camera. "My name is Arthur Whitlow," he said, his voice the same resonant baritone I'd heard my whole life. He stated the date and the time. "I am recording this statement of my own free will. Without duress or influence, I have asked my lawyer to be present." He nodded to someone off-screen. "I am doing this because I anticipate a challenge to my last will and testament." He took a breath. "I have left my entire estate to my granddaughter, Sutton Hale. I have done this for one reason, and one reason only. She is the only one who earned it. Not through flattery, not through manipulation, but through the simple, profound, and unending act of being present. He detailed the monthly payments to Diane. He detailed her absences. He detailed his own broken heart, not with emotion, but with the cold, hard facts of a judge reviewing a case. I have spent the last 2 decades, he said, his voice hardening, paying my daughter a retainer fee to be absent from my life and the life of her child. I will not, in death, reward her for that abandonment. This estate is not for her. It is for the woman who sat with me, who cared for me, who debated me, and who, unlike my own child, never once asked me what was in it for her. He leaned closer to the camera. Sutton is my daughter in every way that matters. This is my final word. This is my judgment. The video ended. I sat in the dark, the only light coming from the laptop screen. This was not a family dispute. It was not a tragedy of misunderstanding. This was a long con, a 22-year pattern of systematic financial exploitation, perpetrated by my parents and documented by my grandfather. And now, they had brought their con into my courtroom. They had mistaken my grief for weakness. They had mistaken his love for senility. They were about to find out, in exacting detail, just how wrong they were. I closed the laptop, I picked up the ledger, the emails, and the note about Camille Ortiz. I had my evidence, I had my timeline, I had my case. I returned from New Harbor with a box of evidence that could win a fraud case, but I was facing a hearing on testamentary capacity in less than 6 days. I had the what. Now I needed the who. My grandfather, a man of profound foresight, had left me a map. My first stop was not Evan's office, but a small cafe near the Rivergate Courthouse called The Gavel. Judge Eliza Rowan was already there, sitting in a booth, a cup of black coffee untouched in front of her. She was in her late 70s, with eyes that had seen every lie a human being could tell. She had been Arthur Whitlow's closest friend on the bench for 30 years. She was, in every sense, his equal. "Sutton," she said, not standing, but gripping my hand with a wiry strength. "Arthur told me this day would come. He called them the vultures." "Judge," I said, sliding into the booth. "They're moving fast. Lyle is trying to paint him as senile and me as manipulative." "Of course he is," she said, finally taking a sip of coffee. "It's the only play he has. Arthur's mind was a fortress. The man was drafting a law review article on appellate jurisdiction 2 months ago. But fog, as Lyle calls it, is easy to allege and difficult to disprove in the press. We won't fight this in the press. We will fight it with an army of experts." She slid a piece of paper across the table. It had 2 names on it. "You have Evan Rourke. He's a good litigator," she said. "But he'll need ammunition. The first name is Jonah Pike. He's a civil investigator. Used to be a detective. Got tired of the bureaucracy. He finds things. Bank accounts, disgruntled associates, hidden debts. He's expensive, and he's discreet. The second is Dr. Noor Levitt. She's the best geriatric psychiatrist in the state. She wrote the book on testamentary capacity. She can take Arthur's medical files and turn them into an unassailable fortress of fact." "He told me to find Camille Ortiz," I said. Eliza smiled. "Arthur always had his pieces on the board. Camille was his home nurse for the last 2 years. She's the foundation. Levitt is the one who will build the house on top of it." She leaned in. "Sutton, you are a prosecutor. You know how to build a case, but this is not a criminal case. The burden of proof is different, and the enemy is your own blood. Do not hesitate, and do not show them a single shred of mercy. They are not your family." The war room was Evan Rourke's conference room, a sterile glass box overlooking the city. We assembled the team. Jonah Pike looked less like a detective and more like a burnt-out college professor, all tweed and messy hair. But his eyes were sharp. Dr. Noor Levitt was immaculate, precise, and spoke with a quiet authority that demanded attention. Our first call was to Camille Ortiz. We put her on speakerphone. Her voice was warm, no nonsense, and filled with an almost tangible integrity. Judge Whitlow, she said, was sharper than any of us. He demanded I administer the mini mental state exam every single Monday.
Why? Evan asked.
He said he was building a firewall, Camille replied. He knew his daughter. He knew she would come for his money. He wanted an objective, weekly record of his own lucidity. His last score, 4 days before he passed? 29 out of 30. He only missed 1 point because he couldn't remember the name of the county. And frankly, he said, "Who cares about the county? I know I'm in my study." He signed every one of my timesheets, every medication log, and every single care plan document himself. He was, until the very last breath, in complete and total control of his faculties. While Camille spoke, Dr. Levitt was already reviewing the medical files I'd retrieved, her pen making sharp, decisive notes. "This is perfect," Levitt murmured. "He's created his own baseline. It's not just a snapshot. It's a 2-year longitudinal study of his own competence. Lyle won't be able to touch this." Next, Evan introduced Nadia Beck, a forensic accountant he'd brought in. I spread the contents of the wooden box on the table. The ledger, the bank statements, the emails, Nadia, a woman who seemed to run on caffeine and numbers, plugged everything into her laptop. For an hour, the only sound was her rapid-fire typing. Finally, she turned her monitor around. "They aren't just greedy," she said. "They're systematic." She had created a graph. It was a visualization of my entire life. 2 lines, one, a flat, steady blue line, represented the $2,500 monthly payments from Arthur to Diane. The second line, a jagged, angry red, represented additional lump sum transfers. This red line spiked with perfect, predictable regularity. It spiked in alignment with Peter's known gambling losses. It spiked in alignment with credit card statements showing vacations to the Mediterranean and Hawaii. Every time Peter's debts became critical, Nadia explained, Diane would initiate contact. "You see here," she pointed to a cluster of emails. "The requests for money, disguised as family emergencies, line up perfectly with the subsequent wire transfers. The total documented financial extraction, beyond the monthly allowance, is over $660,000. She had taken the contents of my grandfather's box of pain and turned it into Plaintiff's Exhibit A. "Now the media," Evan said, pacing. "Lyle has already started." He was right. An anonymous colleague from the prosecutor's office had forwarded me an article from a local gossip blog. The headline was, "Abandoned Mother, Grieving Daughter Locked Out of Family Home by Cold-Hearted Prosecutor." It was a masterpiece of fiction. It painted Diane as a devoted mother who had made the heartbreaking sacrifice of letting her parents raise me while she and Peter struggled to build a life. It quoted a source close to the family who said Diane was devastated that her ungrateful daughter had used her legal wiles to poison her own grandfather against her. "They're painting me as the villain," I said, my voice flat. "Of course," Evan said. "Lyle is playing the emotion card. We will not engage in a public he said, she said. We are not going to sling mud. We are going to build a dossier." His strategy was clinical. We create a media file. We don't release it. But if the press contacts us, we provide a simple, fact-checked response. For every one of their claims, we have a document. They claim she was a devoted mother. We have a timeline of 18 major life events she missed. They claim she was locked out. We have the guest logs from Arthur's home, showing she visited exactly twice in 5 years. We will not be emotional. We will be factual. We let the documents speak for themselves. That afternoon, I took the wooden box, the black ledger, the USB drive, and the printed-out emails. I signed them over to Evan, one by one, creating a formal chain of custody log. He placed them in his firm's fireproof vault. It was a prosecutor's habit. It prevented accidental losses, fires, or theft. It treated the evidence of my life with the same sterile respect I would give to a murder weapon. We had the medical defense. We had the financial motive. But something was still missing. The desperation. The $2.7 million was a lot of money, but the viciousness of Lyle's attack, the preemptive media campaign, felt like something more than just greed. It felt like panic. That's when Jonah Pike, who had been silent for 2 hours, finally spoke. "It is panic," he said, tapping on his own laptop. "I've been looking into Peter Hale's semi-pro hobby. He's not just a gambler. He's in debt. Deep." He pulled up a file. It was a scanned document. It was crude, poorly typed, and had a watermark from a check-cashing store. "This," Jonah said, "is a copy of an unsecured loan agreement. It's an illegal contract. Really. Peter Hale borrowed $150,000 6 months ago. The lender isn't a bank. It's a man named Rafe Morello. He's a bookie with connections. I read the terms. The interest rate was criminal. The payment was due in full. 1 week from now. He can't pay it," Jonah continued. "So, 2 months ago, he signed this." He pulled up a second document. My stomach dropped. It was a new contract. An addendum. It was a lien. Peter Hale, in exchange for an extension on his loan, had signed over his expected future inheritance from the estate of Arthur Whitlow. He had, in effect, mortgaged my grandfather's will to a loan shark. "This is the real motive," I said, the pieces snapping into place with a sickening click. Lyle's lawsuit, the injunction, the expedited hearing, it was all a desperate attempt to get their hands on the money, or at least freeze it, before this Morello character came to collect. "And not just the $2.7 million, Evan said, reading the document. "He's trying to save his skin. Morello isn't the kind of man who files a civil suit." The entire case reformed in my mind. This wasn't a daughter fighting for her birthright. This was a desperate, addicted man and his enabling wife trying to stop a shark from breaking their legs. They were using my grandfather's memory and my professional reputation as a shield. "All right," Evan said, his voice hard. "We have our strategy. We have our witness list, Camille Ortiz and Dr. Levitt to establish capacity, Nadia Beck to establish the 22-year history of financial exploitation, Arthur's bank manager, Wyatt Cole, to testify about Diane's attempts to get power of attorney, and Marla Chenoweth, Arthur's old court clerk, to testify to his state of mind at his retirement party. And now," he looked at Jonah, "we have the real motive." I left the conference room as the sun was setting, the city lights beginning to blur against the glass. The team was in place, the evidence was secure, the battle lines were drawn. I had one last thing to do. The next morning, I walked into my boss's office at the Rivergate County Prosecutor's Office. I formally submitted my request for a 2-week leave of absence. I then handed him a signed memorandum, officially declaring a conflict of interest in the civil case of Hale vs. Hale, and stating that I would not, under any circumstances, use any county resources, time, or authority in relation to my personal legal matters. He read it, signed off on my leave, and looked at me. "Sutton," he said, "go win." I walked out of the prosecutor's office, leaving my badge and my professional identity behind. I was no longer Assistant County Prosecutor Hale. I was just Sutton, the defendant, and I was finally ready for trial. The week leading up to the capacity hearing was not a legal battle. It was a psychological war. Lyle and my parents, having failed to secure an immediate injunction, pivoted from a legal strategy to a campaign of assassination, character assassination, mine. It began on Tuesday. The headline was splashed across the front page of the Rivergate Local, the same paper that had once printed my photo for securing a fraud conviction. This time, the headline was different. "Prosecutor manipulates lonely grandfather." My name wasn't in the sub-headline, but it didn't need to be. The article was a viscous soup of anonymous sources and carefully worded insinuations. It described a once brilliant judge, reduced to a lonely recluse, and a calculating granddaughter who swooped in to isolate him from his devoted, heartbroken daughter. They painted my weekly visits, my medical advocacy, my entire life of being present as a long con. They were projecting their own strategy onto me. The article was waiting on my doorstep when I got home from Evan's office. I stood there on the mat, the cheap newsprint gray in the twilight, and felt a cold, sharp anger, different from the adrenaline of the courtroom. This was personal, and it was public. They were attacking my name. The next day, Diane's PR team escalated. They released a photograph to the blogs. It was me, age 21, beaming, holding my undergraduate honors plaque. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated pride. Grandfather Arthur had taken the photo himself. The caption they provided, which was quoted verbatim, read, "Sutton Hale, seen here celebrating a college award. A source close to the family says she was always focused on the prize and was posing with what she knew would one day be her assets." They had taken a memory of love and twisted it into an accusation of greed. They turned my success into a motive. But the most dangerous attack came on Wednesday. Peter, who I'd always dismissed as a bumbling, weak-willed accessory, proved he had a certain low cunning. My boss at the prosecutor's office called me at home. "Sutton," he said, his voice uncharacteristically formal, "I received an anonymous letter today regarding your case." "I understand, sir," I said, my spine straightening. "It alleges," he continued, "that you have been using county resources, paralegals, our server databases, and your office time to build your private civil case. It accuses you of abuse of public funds. It was a kill shot. An accusation like that, even if unproven, would permanently stain my career. It was designed to force my resignation or, at least, to poison my reputation with the one community that had respected me." I didn't panic. I reverted to my training. "Sir," I said calmly, "I anticipated this. I am on my way." I had been on official leave. I hadn't set foot in the building, but I had kept my own logs. As a prosecutor, I document everything. I spent the next hour at my home computer. I compiled my server logs from the office, which showed zero activity from my credentials since my leave began. I printed my official, signed leave of absence form. I gathered the itemized, time-stamped receipts and invoices from Evan's firm, Jonah Pike's investigation agency, and Dr. Levitt, proving every dollar of my defense was paid from my personal savings. I created a full, unassailable timeline of my actions since the moment I was served. I walked into my boss's office an hour later and placed a single, 1-inch thick binder on his desk. "That is my voluntary internal audit, sir," I said. "It contains my server logs, my timesheets, my leave documentation, and a full, notarized accounting of my legal defense fund. The accusation is false, and that is the proof." He opened the binder. He flipped through the first few pages, his eyes scanning the logs. He looked at the receipts. He saw the precision of my defense. He closed the binder. "This is more than sufficient, Sutton," he said. He looked at me, the formality gone. "This is a despicable tactic. Go finish your fight. Your job will be here when you get back." I had doused Peter's fire with cold, hard facts. Lyle, realizing his proxy attacks on my reputation were failing, came at me directly. On Thursday, Evan received an emergency motion. Lyle was petitioning the court for a compulsory psychological examination of me. "He's not just implying undue influence anymore," Evan said, his voice tight with anger as he read the filing over the phone. "He's claiming you suffer from a pathological control disorder and antisocial tendencies that made you uniquely capable of overpowering the will of a vulnerable adult. He's trying to put you on trial, not the will." "He's trying to get a circus," I said, closing my eyes. "He wants to leak the evaluation. He wants another headline. Prosecutor ordered into psych eval." "I'm filing our opposition right now," Evan said. "This motion is irrelevant, prejudicial, and a blatant, bad faith attempt at character assassination. It has zero bearing on Arthur Whitlow's state of mind on the day he signed the will. Collier is a smart judge. She will not allow this." Evan's legal response was a masterpiece of cold fury. Citing case law that defined the precise, narrow scope of a capacity hearing, he argued that Lyle's motion was not just irrelevant, it was an act of procedural abuse, and he requested the court consider sanctions. The motion was denied by Judge Collier less than 3 hours later, without comment. Another attack parried. But the cumulative effect of the week was a low-grade tremor in my hands. The headlines, the betrayal, the attack on my career, the violation of the psych-eval motion, it was a sustained, multi-front war. I refused to let them see me break. I held on to my balance through the small, rigid rituals that had always grounded me. At 5 a.m. every morning, when the sky was still a dark, bruised purple, I ran. I ran hard, my feet pounding the pavement of Rivergate, pushing past the pain, focusing on my breath, on the burn in my lungs. It was the 1 hour I was not a defendant. I was just a body in motion. I wrote in my journal, not about my feelings, but about the facts. I logged the attacks and my responses, just as I had for my boss. I wrote down the evidence we had. I organized my thoughts into logical frameworks. It was my way of caging the anxiety. And I measured my pulse. I used the watch my grandfather had given me. When I felt the anxiety rise, the tightness in my chest, I would stop, close my eyes, and watch the numbers. 110 beats per minute after reading Lyle's motion, 95 after Diane's email. I would breathe, deliberately, until the number dropped back below 70. I used data to master the panic. Then, on Friday, with the hearing just days away, came the most insidious attack of all. It wasn't a headline or a motion, it was an email. From Diane. The subject, "We are still a family." My pulse jumped. I opened it. "Sutton, darling," it began. "This has all gone too far. Graham Lyle is an aggressive lawyer, and your father is just desperate. This isn't what I wanted. I miss my father. I miss you. We are your parents. Can't we just solve this? Just the three of us? We are prepared to be generous. A 60-40 split. You get the 40%. It's more than fair. And it ends all of this. We can be a family again, because I'm your mother, and I love you." I read it twice. The audacity of it. The casual, breathtaking assumption that after a week of trying to destroy my life, she could offer me a generous 40% of my own inheritance. The emotional bribe. The weaponized "I love you." I thought of the $660,000 in the ledger. I thought of the 22 years of IOUs. I took a breath. I watched my heart rate on my watch. 85, 80, 75. I typed my reply. It was 2 sentences. To Diane Hale, "The court will answer for me. Please preserve this communication for your lawyer, as I will be forwarding it to mine." I hit send. That was the prosecutor's response. Cold, final, and it turned her emotional plea into another piece of evidence. The tension was a high-frequency wire humming in the background of my life, but our case was getting stronger. Jonah Pike called Evan. "Got something you need to see," he said. We met at Evan's office. Jonah put a laptop on the table. Lyle, Peter, and Rafe Morello, the loan shark. He played the video. It was grainy, black and white, from a parking lot security camera outside a seedy sports bar, dated 2 nights ago. There was Lyle, his expensive suit looking comically out of place. There was Peter, shifting nervously from foot to foot, and there was Morello, a large, imposing man who looked like he'd never smiled. The body language was clear. Morello was angry. He was jabbing a finger into Peter's chest. Lyle was talking fast, his hands up in a placating gesture. "They're meeting with the creditor," I said. "Lyle isn't just representing my parents. He's representing their debt." "He's trying to negotiate an extension for Peter," Jonah said. "He's probably using the lawsuit as proof that he'll have the money soon. Morello doesn't look convinced." And then, Camille Ortiz delivered the final, hermetically sealed piece of our defense. She arrived at Evan's office with a locked document case. "Judge Whitlow was meticulous," she said, handing the case to Evan. "This is a complete copy of his medication logs, my nursing notes, and the file of his weekly MMSE tests. The last one was 2 months before he passed, but I have my notes from the week he died." Evan opened the file. On top was the official test form, mini mental state examination, Score, 29 out of 30, signed by Arthur Whitlow.
What did he miss? Evan asked.
Camille permitted herself a small smile. The date. He said, "It's Tuesday, the 21st. It was Tuesday, the 22nd. He then spent 5 minutes arguing with me that the New York Times had a misprint in its dateline. He was lucid, he was argumentative, and he was fundamentally sharper than I am. Graham Lyle can argue about fog all he wants. I have 2 years of data that says the man was a steel trap. I looked at the video of Peter cowering before his creditor. I looked at the test score that proved my grandfather's brilliance. And I finally truly understood. Diane and Peter weren't afraid of losing the lawsuit. They had already lost me, and my grandfather, decades ago. They didn't care about the money in the way a greedy person does. They needed it. They were not afraid of Judge Collier. They were terrified of Rafe Morello. This lawsuit wasn't an act of greed. It was an act of pure, animal fear. They weren't fighting for a birthright. They were fighting for their lives, and they would say, or do, absolutely anything to win. The doors to courtroom 3B were a heavy, dark wood that muffled the noise of the outside hallway. Inside, the silence was different. It was the compressed, electric quiet of a room waiting for a verdict. The gallery was full. The Rivergate local reporter was back, this time with a sketch artist. My parents, Diane and Peter Hale, were at their table. Diane already dabbing at her eyes. Graham Lyle, their lawyer, looked confident, his papers arranged in neat, aggressive stacks. I sat beside Evan Rourke. I did not look at the gallery. I did not look at the plaintiffs. I looked at the witness stand. This was my turf. Today, we would not be talking about feelings. We would be talking about facts.
All rise, the bailiff called.
Judge Miriam Collier entered, her black robe seeming to absorb the light in the room. She took her seat and put on her glasses, her expression identical to the one she wore during a drug sentencing. Impatient, focused. "Mr. Rourke," she said, "this is your hearing. You may call your first witness." "The defense calls Dr. Noor Levitt," Evan said. Dr. Levitt walked to the stand. She was the physical opposite of the confused old man narrative Lyle was pushing. She was crisp, precise, and radiated an intimidating intelligence. Evan began, his voice calm, establishing her credentials: Dean's List, Johns Hopkins, Chief of Geriatric Psychiatry at a major Philadelphia hospital, author of 3 textbooks on cognitive decline and testamentary capacity. By the time he finished, she was not just a witness, she was the final word on the subject. "Doctor," Evan said, "you reviewed the complete medical file of the decedent, Judge Arthur Whitlow?" "I did," Dr. Levitt said, her voice clear, "including 2 years of daily nursing notes from Ms. Camille Ortiz and a complete file of weekly mini-mental state examinations, or MMSEs, administered at the judge's own request. And what did you find regarding his cognitive state in the months leading up to and including the date he signed his revised will?" "Judge Whitlow was not in a fog, as the plaintiff's motion suggests," Dr. Levitt stated, looking directly at the judge. "His cognitive function was not just baseline, it was in the high normal, the superior range for his age cohort. His MMSE scores were consistently 29 or 30 out of a possible 30. He was, by all medical standards, exceptionally lucid." Evan nodded. "Thank you, doctor. No further questions." Lyle stood, a sympathetic smile plastered on his face. He was shifting tactics. "Dr. Levitt," he began, his voice dripping with false concern, "a man can be lucid, but still be terribly lonely, can't he? Isn't it true that a man of his age, living in that large, empty house, would be uniquely susceptible to influence from the one person who was visiting him?" It was a smart trap. He was conceding capacity, as he had to, and pivoting to the lonely old man theory of undue influence. "Doctor?" Levitt did not take the bait. "Mr. Lyle, loneliness is a subjective emotional state, ideal in objective data. The data shows Judge Whitlow did not have an empty life. He maintained a robust and stable social network.
Lyle looked confused. A social network? What network?
He had weekly, documented, in-person visits from his granddaughter, Ms. Hale, Dr. Levitt said, ticking points off on her fingers. He had daily phone calls with his former clerk, Ms. Chenoweth. He had bi-weekly dinners with his colleague, Judge Eliza Rowan. He had an active, contentious correspondence with the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. Judge Whitlow's isolation, according to his own notes and those of his nurse, was not a product of loneliness. It was a specific, deliberate, and consistently enforced boundary he established against your clients.
Lyle's smile vanished.
"No further questions," he snapped.
"The defense calls Wyatt Cole," Evan said.
The nervous bank manager from New Harbor walked to the stand. He clutched his hands together. Evan kept his voice gentle. "Mr. Cole, you were the branch manager for Judge Whitlow's bank for 12 years?"
"Yes, sir. I saw the judge often."
"Did you ever have dealings with the plaintiff, Diane Hale?"
"Yes, sir. On 3 occasions in the last year." Cole's voice was quiet. "She came in. She was trying to access his accounts." "How?"
"The first time," Cole said, "she presented a durable power of attorney. It purported to give her full control of all his assets."
"And did you honor it?"
"No, sir. The signature. It was a forgery, and not a very good one. I declined the request. The second time, she tried to wire $50,000, claiming it was for an emergency roof repair on his home. I called the judge to confirm. He told me his roof was fine and to freeze the account."
"Objection!" Lyle shouted, jumping to his feet. "Relevance. This is inflammatory. This is a hearing on capacity, not on alleged forgery."
Judge Collier leaned forward, her eyes cold. "Mr. Lyle, your client's repeated, documented attempts to gain access to the decedent's finances before his death are exceptionally relevant to determining the motives behind this lawsuit. Overruled. Sit down." Evan continued. "And the third time, Mr. Cole?" She claimed the judge was confused, that he was not himself, and that the bank should recognize her as his caregiver. She said he was losing his mind. "When was this?" Cole checked his notes. 6 months before he passed, the same week he signed his new will. A low murmur went through the gallery. Lyle was pale. Evan's next witness was Marla Chenoweth, Arthur's clerk for 20 years. She was a woman in her 60s, sharp and fiercely loyal. "Marla," Evan said, "you were aware Judge Whitlow was amending his will?" "I was," she said, her voice firm. "He took me to lunch to discuss it. He brought a draft. He was furious." "Furious?" "At his daughter. He said she'd been trying to have him declared incompetent, but he wasn't confused. He was the opposite of confused. He was precise. He wanted me to be a witness, not on the will itself, but to his state of mind. He read the entire will, aloud, to me, in the middle of that restaurant." She smiled, a small, sad memory. "He read every clause, every trust, every contingency. Then he started debating Article 4, Section 2, with me. He thought the wording was weak. He was a judge, to the very last. He was not influenced. He was the influencer." I kept my eyes on the legal pad in front of me. I did not look at Diane. I would not. I could feel her staring at me, her toxic, theatrical grief trying to bore a hole in my head. I focused on the grain of the wood on the table. I just listened to the truth. Lyle, in a desperate move, called a rebuttal witness, a former colleague of Arthur's, a man named Samuel Finch, who testified that Arthur had seemed confused and lost at the club. Evan's cross-examination took less than 2 minutes. "Mr. Finch, you and Judge Whitlow had a public dispute over the club's finances 3 years ago, correct?" "Well, I wouldn't say—" "You were the treasurer. He was on the audit committee. He accused you of mismanaging funds, and then he resigned. Is that not true?" "He misunderstood the books." "So you haven't spoken to him in 3 years. But you are now qualified to assess his mental state in his final months? Thank you. Mr. Finch, no further questions. Finch scurried off the stand. The first phase of the battle was over. Evan had built a fortress of facts.
Your Honor, Evan said, his voice resonating in the quiet room. The defense has one final piece of evidence regarding the decedent's capacity.
We called Judge Arthur Whitlow. The gallery gasped. Lyle shot up. Objection. That is grotesque. It's a cheap stunt. It is a notarized, time-stamped video deposition, Your Honor, Evan said calmly. Recorded by Judge Whitlow with his attorney for this exact purpose, the chain of custody is intact. Judge Collier stared at Evan. The court will see it. The lights dimmed. The large monitor on the wall, usually reserved for complex financial charts, flickered on.
And there he was, my grandfather.
He was not the weak, fading man Lyle had described. He was sitting in his study, the gray Atlantic churning out the window behind him. He was thinner, yes, but his eyes were sharp, bright, and filled with a terrible, clarifying anger. He looked directly into the camera. He looked at me. My name is Arthur Whitlow, his voice boomed, filling the courtroom. It was the same voice I'd heard read me trial summaries at night. It is October 10th. I am in my right mind, and I am recording this statement to preempt the legal fiction I know my daughter, Diane Hale, will attempt to spin upon my death. Diane let out a small, strangled cry. Peter sank lower in his chair. For 22 years, Arthur said, his judicial tone unwavering, I have paid my daughter a monthly stipend, hoping she would participate in the life of her child. She took the money. She did not participate. I have watched her try to defraud my bank. I have listened to her attempts to have me declared incompetent. He leaned closer to the lens. I am leaving my entire estate to my granddaughter, Sutton Hale. This is not a decision made in a fog. It is a decision made in absolute clarity. It is not a decision of influence. It is a decision of mathematics, of presence. My granddaughter was present every day. My daughter was an absence, subsidized by my own hope. You cannot inherit what you have already abandoned. He paused, and his eyes seemed to find mine through the screen. They will say this is not about blood. They are correct. Presence is the real bloodline. This is my final word. This is my judgment. The screen went black. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb. The sketch artist's charcoal was still. The reporter's pen had stopped moving. Diane was openly sobbing, but it was not the quiet, dignified grief she had performed earlier. It was the raw, ugly sound of a gambler who had just lost everything. Judge Collier took a long, slow breath. She looked at the screen, then at her desk. This court, she said, her voice quiet but firm, has heard sufficient evidence on the matter of testamentary capacity. Lyle, scrambling, stood. Your Honor, this video, it proves the isolation, the anger. Mr. Lyle, Judge Collier cut him off, her voice like ice. The evidence presented by the defense, from Dr. Levitt, from the bank manager, from Ms. Chenoweth, and now from the decedent himself, is definitive. The plaintiff's motion to invalidate this will on the grounds of lack of capacity is summarily denied. Judge Whitlow was, beyond any doubt, of sound and lucid mind. I let out a breath I had been holding for a week. We had won. But Judge Collier wasn't finished. However, she continued, this hearing was specifically and narrowly focused on capacity, the separate, and much thornier, claim of undue influence still stands. This court will not dismiss the case outright. We will proceed to a full trial on that matter. Elway's head snapped up. He had been given a lifeline. He had lost the capacity argument, but the judge was giving him a second chance to argue that I had been the one pulling the strings. He looked over at me, his eyes glittering. He smiled. He thought he could still win. He thought he could pivot from senile old man to calculating manipulative prosecutor. We were ready for that. I stood. I calmly put my notebook into my briefcase. I nodded to Evan. I walked out of the courtroom, my heels clicking on the blue-veined marble. I did not run. I did not look back. I stepped into the bright, fluorescent-lit hallway. The adrenaline faded, replaced by a cold, clear resolve. I looked down at my hand. The tremor that had plagued me all week was gone. It was perfectly, completely steady. The first sword had been drawn, and it had struck true. My grandfather's honor was intact. Now, it was time to draw the second. We had won the battle over my grandfather's mind, but the war for his legacy and my reputation was just beginning. Judge Collier had denied their motion on capacity, but had left the door wide open for Lyle to argue undue influence. He intended to paint me as a calculating puppet master, and he would be facing a full, public jury trial to do it. Lyle had pivoted, but so had we. The fight was no longer about Arthur's medical charts. It was about Diane and Peter's bank statements. Our war room at Evan's firm shifted from a medical defense to a financial prosecution. The star witness was no longer Dr. Levitt. It was Nadia Beck, the forensic accountant. She pinned her final presentation to the main wall of the conference room. It was a massive, intricate flowchart that looked like the wiring diagram for a bomb. "This is their entire financial life for the last 5 years," Nadia said, pointing with a laser. "It's a house of cards." She detailed her findings, and the cold, hard numbers told a story more damning than any accusation of fog. "Here," she said, tapping the chart. "You see the spikes in Peter's known gambling losses? I've correlated them with the minor league baseball playoffs. Every October, like clockwork, he loses a 5-figure sum. And here," she moved the laser. 2 days later, you see Diane's credit card spending spike. She's not paying debts. She's buying luxury goods, handbags, spa treatments, a car lease. It's a classic cycle of panic and compensation. "But," Nadia continued, "that's not the best part. How are they paying for this lawsuit? How are they paying Mr. Lyle? How are they paying for the PR firm that's slandering you?" She pointed to a new entity on the chart. "This, DH Consulting, LLC, a shell corporation registered by Diane Hale 3 months ago. It has no clients. It has no product. It has one asset, a single, high-interest line of credit for $200,000, secured against their house, a house that's already mortgaged to the hilt." "They're paying for the lawsuit with borrowed money," I said. "Worse," Nadia said. "They're paying their lawyers, their PR team, and their own living expenses with cash advances from this line of credit. They're betting everything on this lawsuit. They're not just trying to win $2.7 million. They are already $250,000 in the hole just to sit at the table." That's when Jonah Pike, our investigator, slid a document onto the table. It was the one he'd found earlier, the contract with the loan shark, Rafe Morello. "And this is why," Jonah said. "This is the why. The shell corporation is for the lawsuit. This is for Peter's life." He laid out the contract selling Peter's future inheritance, the $150,000 loan, the criminal interest rate, the thumbprint of Rafe Morello pressed next to Peter's shaky signature. "This is our motive," Evan said, his voice flat. "This is the real undue influence, not Sutton influencing Arthur, but Morello influencing Peter. They're not plaintiffs. They're hostages." "It gets better," Jonah said, tossing a printout onto the table. It was an email. An email from Graham Lyle's professional account to a private, encrypted address that Jonah had traced to Peter. The subject line was, "Urgent, M, timeline." The M, we knew, stood for Morello. The email was short and terrifying. "Peter," it read, "I cannot stress this enough. I cannot negotiate with him any further without proof of funds. We must get the assets frozen. I am pushing the judge for an expedited hearing, but we need to show progress before he decides to collect." I read it twice. "My God," I whispered. Lyle knew. He knew about the loan shark from the beginning. "He's not just a lawyer in this," Evan said, his face dark.
He's a co-conspirator. He's using the court as a shield to protect his client from a criminal. He's been lying to Judge Collier since day one. And he's not the only one with a pattern, Jonah said. He dropped a stack of public records on the table. Diane Hale, plaintiff. I saw a case from 2004. Hale v. Estate of Mildred Whitlow. Diane had sued her own aunt, Arthur's sister, over a silver set and a painting. She'd lost. Then, another, 2011, Hale v. Thompson. She had contested the will of her own cousin. She'd lost that one, too.
This isn't her first time, I said. This is a pattern of behavior. She's a serial litigant. She sees a death in the family as an income opportunity. This is what we give the jury, Evan said, pacing. This is the story. A failed, desperate gambler, a serial litigant for a wife, and a loan shark waiting in the wings. This is the influence that's driving this case. Jonah held up a final piece of evidence, a USB drive. The bar video, he said. We had seen the still images. Now he played the full security footage of the meeting between Lyle, Peter, and Rafe Morello. The grainy, black-and-white video was damning. We watched Morello jab his finger into Peter's chest. We watched Lyle talk, his hands placating. And then we saw it. Peter, his hands shaking, reached into his briefcase. He pulled out a stack of papers. He handed them to Morello. The loan shark took them, glanced at the top page, and nodded, satisfied. He put the papers in his own jacket.
What is that? Evan asked, leaning into the screen.
Jonah zoomed in, using the digital copy. The resolution was terrible, but the masthead on the top page was just clear enough. It was the blue and white cover sheet from the Rivergate County Civil Court.
He's giving him the case file, I said, my blood running cold.
He's handing over the official court filings, the motions, my grandfather's will. He's not just handing over papers, Jonah said. He's giving his creditor a scorecard. He's letting the loan shark gamble on the outcome of the trial. The war room was silent. We had just crossed a line from a civil dispute into something far darker. The threat became physical the next day. I got a call, not from Evan, but from Camille Ortiz, the home nurse. Her voice was shaking. Sutton, she said, I think I'm being followed.
What?
A dark car. It's been parked across the street from my house for 2 days. When I left for the grocery store, it followed me. It sat in the parking lot. I'm scared. I know I'm a witness in your case. I don't know what to do. Lock your doors, I said, my prosecutor's voice taking over. Do not go outside. I am handling this right now. I hung up and called Jonah. Jonah, Camille Ortiz is being followed. Dark sedan. Get to her house. Now. On my way, he said. I called Evan. They're intimidating a witness. Evan was furious. Within an hour, he was filing an emergency motion for a protective order for Camille Ortiz, citing the Morello contract and the bar video as proof that the plaintiffs were associated with a violent third party, who now had a vested, financial interest in the outcome of the trial. Judge Collier, seeing the evidence in camera, granted it immediately. Camille was given a temporary police detail. Lyle, my parents, and Morello had just made their single biggest mistake. They had taken their fight from the courtroom to the real world. They had confirmed our entire theory. Evan, seeing the opening, went on the offensive. He filed a massive 50-page motion for sanctions against Graham Lyle for abuse of the legal process. He attached everything. Nadia's financial charts, the history of Diane's failed lawsuits, the Morello contract, the email from Lyle to Peter, the still images from the bar. He argued that the entire lawsuit, from the initial filing to the motion on capacity, was a bad faith fabrication, designed not to seek justice, but to defraud the court and use its power as a bargaining chip with a loan shark. To counter the heartbroken mother narrative, I spent a night with my old diaries and photo albums. I created the Ledger of the Empty Chair. It was a simple, brutal spreadsheet. Column A, date and event. Sutton's 8th birthday, high school debate finals, law school graduation,
18 major life events. Column B, Diane's response. Promise to come. Lost the invitation. Promise to come. Car trouble. Promise to come. Peter's golf tournament. 16 documented, proven promises, all broken. It was the ultimate proof of presence versus absence. It was the data of my abandonment. Evan added it to the pile. The pressure was clearly getting to them. My phone rang, a number I didn't recognize. Sutton? The voice was reedy, panicked. It was Peter. "Don't talk to me, Peter," I said. "Call my lawyer." No, just listen, he pleaded. It's all Diane and that lawyer. It's too much. Look, you don't need all that money, do you? You're a prosecutor. You've got a good job. We just need a piece for my health. I was already recording. My hand was steady on the record button. Your health? This guy, this Morello, he's not a nice man. Sutton, just tell your lawyer you'll settle. Give us half, and we make this all go away. Nobody gets hurt. Just think about it. It would be better for everyone if nobody gets hurt, right? It was a plea, a bribe, and a threat, all wrapped in his pathetic, weak-willed panic. I've recorded this, Peter, I said. Goodbye. I hung up and sent the audio file to Evan. The final shot came, predictably, from Lyle. He was clearly feeling the walls close in. He sent Evan a blistering email, threatening to file a countersuit against me for defamation, slander, and malicious prosecution for introducing the fabricated and inflammatory evidence about Morello. He was bluffing. Evan's reply was a legal work of art. It was one paragraph. Graham, it read, my client, a prosecutor, finds your threats amusing. All the evidence we have submitted is documented, verified, and will be presented to a jury. Your email, however, which attempts to intimidate opposing counsel and quash evidence of your client's criminal association, is now Exhibit A for the sanctions hearing. Any further communication from you, outside of a formal settlement offer of $0 and a full retraction, will be considered harassment. See you in court. Lyle went silent. The house of cards was swaying. Evan filed a final, sweeping motion to admit all of it. The financial charts, the bar video, the call from Peter, the Morello contract, Diane's litigation history, into the public trial record. Judge Collier, seeing the mountain of evidence, and no doubt furious at being lied to in her own courtroom, granted the motion in full. The trial for undue influence was no longer about my relationship with my grandfather. It was about theirs with their creditor. The house of cards, as my grandfather would have called their flimsy stack of lies, was about to collapse. The public trial was scheduled to begin in 1 week. The air in Rivergate was thick with anticipation. We had won the battle of capacity, but Lyle had successfully framed the next fight as one of my character. The narrative was set. I was the cold, calculating prosecutor who had taken advantage of her grandfather. We had our evidence, our timelines, and our financial charts. But I knew juries. I knew that numbers could be boring. They needed a story. They needed a confession. I needed to clear my head. The day before we were set to begin jury selection, I drove to St. Barrow Cemetery. It was a place of old stone and older trees, set on a hill overlooking a quiet stretch of the Rivergate Valley. The air was cold, crisp, and clean. It smelled of damp earth and the sharp, green scent of pine resin. It smelled like the truth. I walked the familiar gravel path, my footsteps the only sound, a stark contrast to the click of my heels on the courthouse marble. I was carrying a small spray of white lilies, simple, his favorite. I reached his grave. The headstone was a simple gray granite slab. Arthur Whitlow, husband, father, judge. I had asked them to add one more word, grandfather. I knelt, brushing a few stray leaves from the stone. The marble was cold, solid, and real. Hi, Grandpa, I whispered. It's a mess. They're doing exactly what you said they would. but we're ready for them. I'm ready. I just wanted to tell you that. I began to arrange the lilies at the base of the stone, my fingers tracing the carved letters of his name. A sound crunched on the gravel behind me. I didn't need to turn. The air had changed. The clean scent of pine was suddenly suffocated by a familiar, expensive cloud of tuberose and entitlement. "We are a family, Sutton." Diane's voice was low, practiced, oozing a sorrow that was utterly false. I stood up slowly, not turning to face her. "You shouldn't be here, Diane." "This is my father's grave," she said, as if she had visited it every day, and not, as I knew from the cemetery logs, for the first time since the burial. I finally turned. She was a caricature of grief, a long black cashmere coat, oversized sunglasses that covered half her face, shielding her from a sun that wasn't there. She looked like a widow from a movie, not a daughter who had missed the funeral. "What do you want?" I asked. My voice was flat. I was not a daughter. I was opposing counsel. I was going through some old boxes," she said, her voice catching in a perfectly rehearsed tremor. She reached into her expensive leather bag. "I found these. I thought you might want them." She held out a small stack of faded square photographs. I looked at them. It was me. Me at 4, on a tricycle, grinning. Me at 5, covered in birthday cake. Me at 7, holding a starfish on a beach in New Harbor. I looked closer. In every single photo, I was alone, or with Arthur, or with Evelyn. She was not in them. She was, as she had always been, the person holding the camera, just outside the frame, an observer of the life she had chosen to abandon. They were props. This was an ambush. "You're using my childhood as a bargaining chip?" I asked. "No," she said, a flash of genuine anger in her voice before she smothered it. "No, I want this to be over. This fighting. It's not what he would have wanted." "What he wanted," I said, my voice as cold as the granite between us, "was for you to show up. He wanted you to be at my graduations. He wanted you to be at my grandmother's funeral. He wanted you to ask about his blood pressure, not his will." I looked from the photos in her hand to her face. "You had these pictures," I said, my voice quiet. "You chose the money. I had the memories. I chose to be present." Her perfectly lipsticked mouth tightened. The sunglasses hid her eyes. But I could see the muscles in her jaw working. She was losing control. The performance was failing. This was not the broken, grateful child she had expected to find. "You don't understand," she hissed. Taking a step closer, the mask was slipping. "You have no idea what's at stake. You sit in your neat little prosecutor's office, with your safe little job. You don't know what real-world pressure is." "Pressure? Like a bad bet?" Her head snapped back as if I had slapped her. "Peter is a fool," she spat. "A weak, pathetic fool. But he's my husband. And you have everything. You have all of it. The house, the portfolio, the 2.7 million. It's not fair." "Fair," I said, "was dinner at 6 o'clock every night. Fair was the man who taught me how to read. Fair was the man who sat with me when I had the flu. You wouldn't know Fair. Diane, you weren't there." "Please," she begged. And now, for the first time, I heard something real in her voice. It wasn't grief. It was sheer, animal panic. This was the woman whose loan was due. This was the woman whose husband owed a debt to Rafe Morello. "Sutton, please," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She grabbed my arm. I flinched, and her hand dropped away. Just tell your lawyer you'll settle. We don't have to go to trial. This all just goes away. If you just sign over the inheritance, just a part of it, not even all of it, just $2 million. The number hung in the air. $2 million, a nice round figure. "If you just sign over $2 million, she rushed on, her words tumbling over each other, "I can make it stop. I can take care of it. They will stop asking." The world stopped. The wind in the pines went silent. My pulse, which had been hammering with anger, suddenly slowed to a cold, steady beat. They will stop asking. It was the pebble hitting the lake, the admission, the confirmation of everything, the direct, verbal link between her, the lawsuit, and the violent third party we knew was pulling the strings. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stared at her. My hand, inside the deep pocket of my wool coat, was clenched. My fingers were wrapped around the small, cold, rectangular shape of the digital voice recorder I had turned on the moment I heard her footsteps on the gravel. A prosecutor's habit: never take a meeting with a hostile witness unprepared. She saw the change in my expression. She saw the stillness, and she knew, instantly, that she had made a fatal error. "Who are they, Diane?" I asked. My voice was a whisper, but it cut through the silence of the cemetery like a scalpel. Her face, already pale, turned the color of ash. Her hand flew to her mouth, not in a delicate dab, but in a raw gesture of panic. I don't know what you mean," she stammered. "You said they will stop asking. Who are they?" She turned away from me, a full, sharp turn, as if she could physically escape the words she had just spoken. Her back was to me. Her shoulders were shaking, but she was not crying. She was fumbling in her purse. I watched her pull out a gold tube of lipstick. Her hand was trembling so violently she could barely open it. She raised it to her mouth, not to reapply, but to anchor herself. She smeared a streak of crimson across her lips, pressed them together in a quick, angry, convulsive motion, and then snapped the tube shut. She was putting her armor back on, but it was too late. The damage was done. My hand came out of my pocket. I wasn't holding the recorder. I just let my empty hand hang at my side. She turned back, the sunglasses firmly in place, the lipstick a grotesque, shaking slash of red. "You are a cold, cruel girl. Sutton," she whispered, her voice venomous. "He poisoned you against me." "No," I said. "You did." I stepped around her, placing the lilies gently at the base of the stone. I straightened up, smoothing the front of my coat. I looked at her one last time. "The court," I said, "will hear all of it." I turned and walked away. I did not look back. I heard her let out a sound, a strange, strangled sob of pure rage and defeat. I just kept walking, my footsteps steady on the gravel path, past the rows of quiet stones, under the sighing pines. I got to my car, parked just outside the iron gates. I got in. I locked the doors. My hands were perfectly steady. I sat for a full minute, the silence of the car deafening. Then, I picked up my phone. "Evan," I said, when he answered. "It's me. I have it." "Have what? Sutton, where are you?" "She was here, at the cemetery. She ambushed me." Did she threaten you?" "She gave us the case," I said. I took my hand off the recorder in my pocket, hit the stop button, and plugged it into the encrypted drive I kept in my glove box. "She's on tape. She offered to drop the suit for $2 million. Evan was silent. "And Evan," I said, as I started the file upload, "I have her, in her own voice, saying, and I quote, 'They will stop asking.'" There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Oh my God. Sutton," he whispered. "You got it. You got the admission. You got the link to the creditor. You got the motive for the entire case. It's over. We can prove coercion. We can prove duress. We can prove everything." "Upload is complete," I said, as the file transfer finished. "Time-stamped and secured. I'm on my way." I hung up the phone and put the car in drive. Before I pulled away, I looked back at the iron gates of St. Barrow. I looked at the tall pines inside. I thought of the man buried under them. He had taught me how to read law books. He had taught me how to build a case. He had taught me the difference between what was fair and what was merely the law. But as I sat there, the digital audio file of my mother's confessions safe on a secure server, I finally truly understood the most important lesson he had ever given me. He had taught me the profound, devastating power of just being quiet and letting the guilty do the talking. The jury box was full. 12 faces,
skeptical and alert, stared at us. This was not the quick surgical hearing on capacity we had already won. This was the full public trial on undue influence. This was where Graham Lyle would try to paint me as a monster, and where we would prove he was a co-conspirator. Lyle rose for his opening statement, his voice a resonant, tragic chord. He paced before the jury, a picture of righteous sorrow. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "this is a case about a tragedy. It is not about money. It is about the sacred, primal bond between a mother and her child, a bond that was systematically severed, poisoned, and destroyed by ambition." He turned and pointed at me. "He was an old man. She was his only child," he said, gesturing to Diane, who produced a perfectly timed, delicate sob. "And she," his finger leveled at me, "was a prosecutor, trained in the art of manipulation, trained in the science of coercion. She used her skills, not for justice, but to isolate a vulnerable man, to warp his mind against his own daughter, and to secure for herself an estate worth $2.7 million. We will prove that this will is not the final word of Judge Arthur Whitlow. It is the final move in a long, cold, calculated game of chess, played by a master manipulator." He sat down. The jury looked at me, their expressions now clouded with suspicion. I stared straight ahead, my face a mask of stone. Evan Rourke stood, buttoning his jacket. He did not pace. He did not raise his voice. He stood still and let the silence settle. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm and factual. "Mr. Lyle is correct about one thing. This case is about a long, calculated game, but my client was not the player." He walked to an easel and placed a large board on it. It was Nadia Beck's financial chart, the 22-year ledger. "This," he said, "is the truth. 264 monthly payments, $660,000, paid by Judge Whitlow to his daughter, Diane Hale, a fee, in essence, for the privilege of raising her child." He flipped the chart, and this is the ledger of the empty chair. 18 major life events, 18 birthdays, graduations, and award ceremonies, 16 of which Diane Hale promised to attend, and 16 of which she missed. He pointed to a third document, and this is the record of 3 separate attempts by Diane Hale to gain power of attorney over her father's finances, including one, as you will see, using a forged document. This lawsuit is not about a mother's broken heart. It is the final, desperate act in a 2-decade history of financial exploitation. We are not here to debate motherly love. We are here to review the receipts. He sat down. The jury looked confused, caught between 2 opposing stories. Now, we had to prove ours. Evan's first witnesses were the foundation. He recalled Dr. Noor Levitt. She methodically, clinically, and devastatingly dismantled the vulnerable old man narrative for the jury, just as she had for the judge. Lyle, on cross-examination, was desperate. "Doctor, you've testified Judge Whitlow was lucid, but isn't it true that a prosecutor, like Ms. Hale, is trained to be unusually persuasive?" "Doctor," Levitt looked at him over her glasses. "Mr. Lyle, in my expert opinion, Judge Whitlow, a man who presided over complex litigation for 40 years, was not persuadable. He was, however, deeply logical. The evidence he saw, his daughter's persistent absence, her financial demands, her attempts at forgery, led him to a logical conclusion. He was not influenced. He was convinced by the facts." Next, Wyatt Cole, the bank manager. This time, Evan didn't just have him testify. He played the bank's CCTV footage for the jury. The 12 jurors watched on a large screen as a grainy, black-and-white Diane Hale stood at the counter, arguing with the teller, pushing a document, the forged power of attorney, under the glass. They saw her face twist in anger when the manager, Mr. Cole, came out and politely refused her. "This was her third attempt?" Evan asked. "Yes, sir," Cole said, "and the one where she claimed he was losing his mind." Then, Camille Ortiz, the nurse.
She repeated her testimony about the weekly mental state exams, about the score of 29 out of 30. "And he spoke to you about the will?" Evan asked. "He did," Camille said, her voice warm. "The day he had it finalized, he sat in his study and read the entire document, aloud, to me. He wanted me to be a witness, not just to his signature, but to his state of mind. He said, 'Camille, they will come for this. I want someone who was in the room to be able to tell the truth.' The foundation was set. Arthur was lucid, and Diane was a documented fraud. Now for the final act. The defense calls Rafe Morello," Evan said. A heavy silence fell on the courtroom. The back door opened, and Morello entered, flanked by 2 lawyers of his own. He was large, imposing, and wore an expensive suit that looked like armor. He had been subpoenaed, and he was clearly furious about it. He took the stand, his eyes scanning the room, landing for a half-second on Peter Hale. Peter shrank in his seat. "Mr. Morello," Evan began, "you are in the business of finance?" "I'm a private lender," Morello said, his voice a low gravel. "And do you have a client by the name of Peter Hale?" Morello's lawyer stood. "Objection. My client's business dealings are private." "Your Honor," Evan countered, "this line of questioning goes to the direct motive of this entire lawsuit." "Overruled," Judge Collier said. "Answer the question, Mr. Morello." "Yes," Morello said. "Peter Hale owes me money." "How much money?" $150,000, plus interest." "And when was this debt due?" Morello smiled, a thin, cold gesture. "It's past due." "And yet," Evan said, "you have not collected. Why is that?" "We came to an arrangement," Morello said. "What arrangement?" Morello looked at Peter again. He signed a new note, a promissory note, secured by his future expected inheritance from this case. He gets paid, I get paid. The jury stirred. A woman in the front row put her hand over her mouth. "So, to be clear, Mr. Morello," Evan said, "you have a direct, 6-figure financial stake in the plaintiffs, Diane and Peter Hale, winning this lawsuit?" "I expect to be paid what I am owed," Morello said. "Thank you. No further questions." Graham Lyle was on his feet, his face flushed. He had to cross-examine. He had to distance himself. "Mr. Morello," Lyle said, "you have never spoken to me, correct?" "No," Morello said. "I have no part in this arrangement of yours." "Not directly," Morello said. "Your Honor," Lyle said, turning to the judge, "this is a smear campaign. My client's private debts have no bearing on whether Ms. Hale unduly influenced her grandfather." "They have every bearing, Your Honor," Evan said, standing, "because Mr. Lyle knew. He knew his clients were not grieving parents. He knew they were debtors, acting in terror of this man." "That is a lie," Lyle shouted, losing his composure. "An absolute fabrication." "Is it?" Evan asked. He nodded to his paralegal. The large screen flickered on again, this time showing an email, Lyle's email, the one to Peter. "Please read the highlighted portion, Mr. Lyle," Evan said. Lyle stared at his own words. It says, "I am pushing the judge for an expedited hearing, but we need to show progress before he decides to collect." "Who?" Evan asked. "Is he?" "That could mean anyone," Lyle stammered. "A bank, a creditor." "A creditor like Mr. Morello?" "I had no knowledge of Mr. Morello." "Then perhaps," Evan said, "you can explain this." The email vanished. It was replaced by the grainy black and white security footage from the sports bar. The jury watched as Lyle, Peter, and Morello stood in the rain-soaked parking lot. They watched Lyle talk, his hands gesturing. They watched Peter, shaking, hand over the court documents to the loan shark. Peter Hale made a sound, a low, strangled gasp. Lyle was ashen. This is an outrage. That video is inadmissible. It proves nothing. It's just a conversation." "I told you," a voice shrieked from the plaintiff's table. Everyone froze. It was Peter. He was on his feet. His chair toppled over behind him, his finger pointing at Lyle. "I told you that was a bad idea. I told you not to meet him. I didn't think the camera was still recording." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was the sound of a bomb detonating. Peter had just confessed. He had just confirmed the meeting. He had just implicated his own lawyer in a conspiracy with a loan shark. Diane grabbed his arm, trying to pull him down, but the damage was done. Judge Collier stared at him, her face a mask of cold fury. "Mr. Hale," she said, her voice dripping with ice, "you will sit down." Peter collapsed into his chair, his face chalky with terror. Lyle was speechless. He just stood there, his mouth open. "Mr. Rourke," Judge Collier said, "do you have anything else?" "Yes, Your Honor," Evan said, his voice quiet. "We have one final piece of evidence regarding the plaintiff's motive." He nodded to the bailiff. "The defense moves to play Exhibit D44, a certified audio recording." The courtroom speakers crackled, and then, there it was, the clean cold air of the cemetery, the sound of gravel, and my voice. "Who are they, Diane?" And then, Diane's voice, not the polished, grieving mother, but the raw, panicked, hissing whisper I had recorded. "If you just sign over $2 million, I can make it stop. I can take care of it. They will stop asking." The audio clicked off. Diane Hale stared at the speaker on the wall as if it were a snake. She looked at me, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She knew she was beaten. Evan Rourke turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "the undue influence in this room, the pressure, the coercion, it did not come from Sutton Hale. It came from that man." He pointed at Morello. "It came from their own desperation, and it came from their own lawyer, who used this court to try and pay a gambling debt. The plaintiffs did not file this suit out of grief. They filed it out of terror." He walked back to our table. "For our closing argument, Your Honor, we would like to play one final video." The screen lit up one last time. It was my grandfather. His face filled the room. His eyes, clear and fierce, seemed to look at every single person, at the jury, at the judge, at Diane. "I have left my entire estate to my granddaughter, Sutton Hale." His voice boomed, clear and strong. "I have done this for one reason, and one reason only. She is the only one who earned it, not through flattery, not through manipulation, but through the simple, profound, and unending act of being present. Presence is the real bloodline. This is my final word. This is my judgment." The video went black. The courtroom was so quiet, I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Graham Lyle, broken, made one last, desperate move. "Your Honor, the defense, the plaintiffs request a continuance," he stammered. We need to conduct a forensic analysis of that video. And the audio. They could be doctored, manipulated." Judge Collier looked at him. It was the coldest look I had ever seen in a courtroom. "Mr. Lyle," she said, "the chain of custody for both the video and audio recordings is immaculate, as provided by Mr. Rourke, your client. Mr. Hale has already confessed to the authenticity of the bar footage, and your other client, Ms. Hale, has not denied the cemetery recording." She shook her head. "Your request for a continuance is denied." She turned to the jury, as if to give them their instructions. Then she stopped. She looked at the mountain of evidence Evan had piled up. She looked at the plaintiff's table, where Peter was openly weeping and Diane was staring into space. "Given the overwhelming evidence," Judge Collier said, her voice ringing with finality, "including the plaintiff's own admissions in this courtroom today, this court finds that no reasonable jury could possibly find for the plaintiff. The claim of undue influence is not just unproven, it has been demonstrably fabricated as part of a conspiracy to defraud this court." She raised her gavel. "I am issuing a directed verdict for the defendant, Sutton Hale. The case is dismissed, with prejudice. This matter is over." The gavel strike was a period,
A full stop, but Judge Collier was not finished. The explosion of noise I expected from the gallery was sucked into the vacuum of the judge's cold fury. She held up a hand, silencing the reporters who were already scrambling to their feet. She looked at the plaintiff's table, where Lyle stood, paralyzed, his mouth still half open. "While the directed verdict concludes the matter of the will itself," Judge Collier said, her voice ringing with the authority of the bench, "this court has several concluding orders based on the egregious conduct witnessed during this trial." She picked up a sheaf of papers, the formal judgment. "First," she read, "the plaintiff's petition to invalidate the last will and testament of Judge Arthur Whitlow on the grounds of lack of testamentary capacity is, as previously ruled, denied. The petition to invalidate the will on the grounds of undue influence is, as of this moment, also denied, in full." She looked at me. "Second, the last will and testament of Judge Arthur Whitlow is hereby affirmed as valid. The court recognizes the decedent's full and lucid intent. Ms. Sutton Hale is confirmed as the sole legal heir to the estate, valued at $2.7 million, and is affirmed as the executor of said estate." A low murmur rippled through the room. She was not done. "Third," her gaze shifted to Peter and Diane, "this court finds that this lawsuit constituted a malicious, vexatious, and bad faith abuse of the judicial process, designed to defraud this court. Therefore, all reasonable legal fees, court costs, and expert witness fees incurred by the defendant, Ms. Hale, shall be borne entirely by the plaintiffs, Diane and Peter Hale." I saw Peter flinch. It was a new debt, a crushing one, that they had no hope of paying. Fourth, she looked past the bar, to where Rafe Morello had been standing. He was already gone. "This court takes note of the testimony regarding a third party, unsecured promissory note. An order is hereby issued permanently enjoining the plaintiffs from any attempt to transfer, assign, or otherwise encumber the assets of the Whitlow estate, which are now the property of Ms. Hale. Furthermore, this court will be notifying the United States Attorney's Office and the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division regarding the nature of the future inheritance contract and the testimony given today regarding Mr. Rafe Morello." She was sending the sharks after the shark. "And finally," she said, her eyes landing on Graham Lyle. He looked ill. "Mr. Lyle, your conduct in this matter represents a severe and disturbing breach of your professional ethics. Your prior knowledge of your client's coercive debts, your meetings with an unsecured creditor, and your bad faith attempts to mislead this court are a disgrace to the bar. This court will be filing a formal complaint and transferring the full, unedited transcript of this trial, including your emails, to the Pennsylvania State Bar Disciplinary Board for immediate review and action." She lifted the gavel high. "This court is adjourned." The sound of the gavel this time was not a punctuation mark. It was an explosion. The room erupted. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions. The sketch artist was drawing furiously. Diane let out a sound. It was not a sob. It was a high-pitched, desperate shriek of pure, unadulterated panic. "Sutton!" She lunged from the table, knocking aside the useless, shell-shocked Graham Lyle. She made it to the low wooden railing that separated the gallery from the court, her hands clawing at the polished wood. "Sutton, you can't let them. I'm your mother. He's your father. You have to help us. Sutton, please." She was not appealing to my love. She was appealing to my wallet. It was the same as her emails, the same as her phone calls, the same as the cemetery, a raw, transactional plea. Before she could try to vault the rail, 2 large court officers stepped in front of her, their arms crossed, a silent, immovable wall. "Ma'am," one said, his voice bored, "you need to calm down." I looked past her, past the chaos. Peter Hale had not moved. He was still sitting at the table, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking in a silent, pathetic collapse. He was a broken man, finally and completely ruined by the debts he thought he could outrun. He didn't even look up. In the back of the room, near the doors, I saw Rafe Morello, who had slipped back in to hear the verdict. He was not angry. He looked at Peter with the flat, assessing disinterest of a man calculating a bad investment. He saw the judge's order. He knew the money was gone. He adjusted the cuffs of his expensive suit, turned with an unhurried, dangerous calm, and disappeared into the hallway. He had lost this battle, but his eyes told me he would collect his debt from Peter in other ways.
Ms. Hale! Ms. Hale! What's your reaction?
The reporters were a wall of sound and light, shoving microphones toward my face.
Do you have anything to say to your parents? How does it feel, Ms. Hale?
I turned, my lawyer Evan Rourke at my side. He was smiling, a thin, satisfied smile. I looked at the reporter from the Rivergate Local, the man who had published the lonely grandfather story. I wanted to give him the real headline. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise of the room. I said only one thing. Presence is the evidence. I turned away from the cameras. I did not need to say another word. I calmly began to place my legal pads and pens into my leather briefcase. My fingers brushed against the thick bound folder that held the black ledger, the book of my grandfather's 22 years of payments. I stopped. I rested my hand on the cover of the briefcase. For a fraction of a second, the worn leather felt warm. It felt impossibly like his hand resting over mine, that steady, strong, reassuring pressure, the hand that had held mine on the gravel driveway in New Harbor, the hand that had given me my first law book. Well done, it seemed to say, right on time. I closed the briefcase. The sharp metallic click of the two latches was the most final sound in the room. High on the courtroom wall, the old clock chimed. The sound was heavy, bronze, bong, bong, bong. 3 o'clock, the end of the day, the end of the case. I nodded to Evan. I turned my back on the chaos of the plaintiff's table. I turned my back on the shrieking, pleading woman who called herself my mother. I turned my back on the reporters. I walked past the jury box, empty now. I walked past the bar. I walked down the center aisle, my heels striking the blue-veined marble. I was not running away from them. I was not chasing them. I was simply leaving them behind, exactly where they had chosen to be. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the courthouse. The hallway air was stale with adrenaline and perfume. I walked through it, toward the main entrance. I stepped out onto the wide stone plaza. A sharp cold wind, the first real wind of autumn, swept across the stairs. It was clean. It smelled of rain and distant leaves, not of tuberose and greed. It felt like the first real breath I had taken in my entire life. It scoured the memory of her perfume from my skin. The sky, which had been a low, oppressive gray all week, had broken. The clouds were gone. Above me, the heavens were a bright, piercing, crystalline blue, like a mirror that had been wiped clean. I stopped on the top landing. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket, the one that sat right next to the cold metal of my prosecutor's badge. My fingers found the small, rectangular shape of the black USB drive, the video of my grandfather, his final word, his judgment. The court had seen it. The world had seen it. The truth was in the record. I didn't need to carry it so close to my heart anymore. I slowly, deliberately, transferred the small drive from my inner pocket to the outer pocket of my coat. It was a simple, physical act, the closing of a file. I looked down the wide, marble steps. They were the same steps I walked up every single morning for work, but today, they were different. They were not leading me to a fight. They were leading me away from one. I had finished my grandfather's last case. I took the first step down, my heel striking the stone with a solid, definitive sound. I was finally, completely, and absolutely free to start my own. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We would love to know where in the world you are listening from. So please drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to Lila Revenge Stories and like this video. And if you want to support us, please hit that hype button so this story can be heard by more people.